Welcome back. Now, Saudi Arabia, Japan and Australia are among a number of nations asking the UN to ensure fossil fuels have at least some role in the world's energy supply in the near future. More than 32,000 submissions from governments to the UN were leaked this week. The nations behind them have been widely described as selfish and worse in many of the British papers this morning. So is this a form of dark lobbying? Or are these countries merely just pursuing their own rational self-interest? Will there continue to be a role for fossil fuels? Storage solutions for wind and solar are not yet here, and nuclear investment remains low. Well, let's find out more with my next excellent guest, Alex Epstein, the writer and energy policy expert and president for the Centre for Industrial Progress. Welcome to the programme, Alex. First of all,
Hi.
This is really bad timing, isn't it? The UK is just gearing up to, in a couple of weeks' time, host one of the largest climate conferences the world has ever seen, and suddenly we see a big leak of documents. What's going on?
Well, I think it's good news if it's understood the right way, because what it shows is that the UN IPCC is a political organization. And I think this should just prompt people to think, how do these reports actually get created? And from beginning to end, from the decision of what research goes into it, and especially to what gets publicized about it, it's political. So, for example, the head of the UN, Guterres, he had this line, "Code Red for Humanity." And the whole media spread that around with the last assessment report. The report didn't say that at all. But because the UN and the IPCC are political organizations, the whole purpose was to say this very alarmist thing. And there's example after example of this being a political organization. I actually think that if you look at what Japan said and what others said, it's actually much more rational than the other political inputs that have been distorting the IPCC.
It's interesting because when I've spoken to climate activists before, both on this channel and elsewhere, they've been claiming that the IPCC has been not radical enough. They say, because the IPCC put out this report a year or two ago saying that the world needs to reach net zero by 2050. The Greta Thunbergs of the world say, no, that's wrong. The scientists are wrong. We need to get there by 2030. To some extent, are the IPCC somehow more moderate than they're being presented by a few people?
Well, I mean, if you want to kill everyone in the world, by depriving them of energy, yes, the UN is too moderate. But if you like, it's pretty obvious the basic flaws of this. So imagine you had a report about vaccines that only looked at the negative side effects of vaccines and didn't look at the benefits. That's basically the IPCC, because all they're designed to do is study the negative climate side effects of fossil fuels and not talk about the benefits. And the most egregious example of this, if you look through, I've looked through the multi-thousand page reports, they do not have one mention of the fact that climate-related disaster deaths are at all-time lows. Imagine that. It's a climate report. They don't note the fact that we're 50 times safer from climate-related death than we were 100 years ago. That's like a polio report that doesn't talk about the polio vaccine. So this is a totally biased report that's only designed to say negative things about fossil fuels.
It does interest me in this conversation that, yes, we may accept that the world is getting warmer, maybe freak weather events may be getting more common, but the world's ability to deal with those events is what matters in terms of outcomes, rather than those events happening themselves. Have we lost that in this conversation? The idea that if we enrich ourselves and therefore make the climate worse, there may be the ability better to deal with that worse climate?
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's my background is as a philosopher primarily. And I think the key philosophical issue here is our goal a livable world or an unimpacted world and climate? And the UN is basically operating on this idea that we should not impact our world and particularly our climate, but we actually should be impacting our world, including our climate. And we absolutely do impact climate with CO2 emissions, but all the benefits, it's not all negative, by the way, but even when there are negatives, the benefits of fossil fuels and industrial civilization are so much greater. And if you look at, again, the UN reports, they don't acknowledge this at all. If you go to the website energytalkingpoints.com, just search IPCC, and you'll see a lot of quotes from them that just show they do not at all value the amazing world we have, a world where since I was born in 1980, extreme poverty went down from 42% of the world to 10% of the world.
I think a lot of people can absolutely agree with that. The world in so many ways has got so much better, particularly extreme poverty. Those reductions have been grand. But also we've seen, for example, reforestation over the last 20 years, something that's not often spoken about. We managed to fix the hole in the ozone layer, although that was through government regulation. Do you not see that there is potentially an argument here that we should make moves if we can, if it's potentially not that intrusive? We know that renewable energy is getting cheaper and cheaper by the day. We know that nuclear power is incredibly powerful and incredibly safe and incredibly low carbon. Are these not useful things to be pursuing in any case? It may make our lives easier in the long run.
Well, I think the way you're thinking about it is certainly reasonable to entertain, but it resembles not at all the way that policymakers are thinking about it. So I know in Britain, you're obsessed with this idea of net zero. Now, what net zero is saying is that no matter what the cost, we are going to eliminate CO2 emissions, or we're going to try by 2050. So that's saying our whole goal is to have an unimpacted climate. Damn all the consequences to humanity. If you look at net zero, there is not one place in the world that is close to net zero. And there's not one human being in a prosperous place who is net zero in a way that can be scaled. So nobody in the world right now who's prosperous is net zero. And yet they're saying mandate that in less than 30 years. That's because they're so obsessed with this god of an unimpacted climate versus saying, yeah, are there cost effective ways to reduce emissions? And I would say nuclear is promising, but the UN is incredibly anti nuclear. They basically kicked out the nuclear people from the upcoming conference. So once again, they're not about a livable world and a livable climate. They're about an unimpacted world, and they're really against any technology that's effective.
I have to say I completely agree with you. It's an absolute scandal that it seems that the nuclear industry has been banned from exhibiting at COP26. It's something we've discussed on this programme before, and a really curious point. Of course, I think most level-headed people think that if net zero is even going to be entertained as a possibility, nuclear has to be part of that mix. But Alex Epstein, are you just saying here that we need to accept that the planet is going to get hotter?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, hotter is it's pretty cold planet. I mean, I live in Southern California, and it's even pretty cold here in October. But yeah, so the planet is, I forget it in Celsius, but let's say it's a little under 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So the planet is cold relative to its history. In general, people like to move toward warm places. I don't think it's intrinsically bad for it to get warm, but in any case, it getting a little bit warmer is absolutely necessary for billions of people to have the energy they need to survive and flourish. So we need to recognize fossil fuels are absolutely essential for billions of people to have energy. And so, yes, they do include some warming. And we really have to take that seriously and recognize that there are billions of people who don't enjoy nearly the standard of living that you and I do. So my view in my book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and in my next book coming out next year, Fossil Future, is the world still needs more fossil fuel. That sounds crazy, but if you look at the numbers and you look at the value of energy, there's no other conclusion to come to.
People can understand that an element of fossil fuels is necessary, whether it's smelting steel or those other really energy-intensive solutions where we don't yet have other technologies. But I'd put it to you that the United Kingdom has been incredibly successful in, for example, getting rid of coal from our energy mix. We've reduced our carbon emissions by stratospheric degrees since 1990, more so than any other country in the G20. The United Kingdom has got much richer as it has decarbonised over the last 30 years.
How's life going there right now? It doesn't.
Is that not an example
Seem like
that
it's
other
going
developed
to
countries can follow?
No, so I think part of what you look, and the U.S. has this to a significant extent as well. And so there are some times when it's cost effective to replace coal with natural gas. That's great. It's not true in China. It's not true in a lot of other places. But if you look at the UK, I mean, in Europe right now, struggling mightily. And why are they struggling mightily? Well, a large part because there was this promise that green energy could replace fossil fuels around the world. And it hasn't been able to fulfill that promise. The other thing you're doing is exporting a lot of production to places like China. So China uses half the world's coal, but you and I and everyone else in the prosperous world, we're using coal via China. So I'm all in favor of natural gas. I'm all in favor of nuclear. Solar and wind are not economic if you look at the full cost. I call them unreliables, not renewables. So those shouldn't be mandated. There should be reliability requirements where everything has to be reliable. And if solar and wind can do that, great. But I don't think the UK is any kind of shining example of energy right now. And without fossil fuels, certainly all those people in Glasgow would die.
Although the people of Glasgow may be wondering, given that the city is on a rather large river that's near the north, that's near the sea, potentially high sea levels may not be great for them. If the ice caps melt, that may be posing real big, expensive difficulties for rich cities. I'm not saying that we're going to see big floods in cities, it just will have very expensive flood defences, and also potentially changing the climate to such a degree that the UK itself may see its Gulf Stream cut off. We'd behave more like Canada than our more temperate climates in the summer. These are some big concerns that carry very, very large costs. Are politicians gathering in Glasgow next month simply being prudent, looking forward to the future and thinking actually dealing with all of these different changes in the climate will be so expensive, potentially moving to some other energy sources now may work out just cheaper after all?
Well, I wish they had your level-headed attitude toward this because I think it would be a lot better. But that's not what they're doing at all. And witness the treatment of nuclear. So I'm one of the world's biggest advocates of nuclear, and nuclear has basically been criminalized around the world. Now that everyone is suffering in Europe, they're finally considering building some nuclear. But why, if the world is obsessed with CO2, are they so anti-nuclear? Why is there such a big anti-hydro movement around the world? And why they don't even seem too concerned about the fact that solar panels and wind turbines are really hard to build in a lot of places, including the US. And so what's going on is this is not a movement about advancing human flourishing and being concerned about climate. It's a movement about eliminating all human impact on Earth. And climate is just an excuse for that because people are legitimately afraid of some of these scenarios, particularly when they don't discover when they don't study the details. So they're like, yeah, let's do something. But if you actually cared about human life, all the forms of doing something would involve expanding the supply of cost-effective energy. And you would sure as hell embrace nuclear. So the fact that they're anti-nuclear shows that they're really anti-human.
I think the nuclear point is something that is so interesting and one that we will be returning to time and time again on this programme, I know. I have to agree with you. I think that some people really try and reject carbon capture and storage, try and reject nuclear energy, try and reject even shale gas, which is a slightly better, good transition fuel if you want lower carbon emissions, certainly, than coal. It's a really interesting field and one that I have no doubt we'll be exploring hugely more. But I'm afraid that's all we have time for in this particular interview. Alex Epstein, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a fascinating discussion. Now, Glasgow is, of course, hosting the COP26 climate conference at the start of next month.